Cleveland, Ohio, the dead of winter. A woman sits in a metal chair shivering under lights that buzz like angry wasps. The air inside the precinct smells of wet wool and absolute betrayal. My name is Palmer Flynn, and in exactly 5 minutes, my parents will try to buy my soul for $40,000. Outside the blizzard howls against the glass, burying the city in white, but in here the cold is human. My sister sent her children into the storm and pinned the crime on me. Now the people who raised me are asking me to take the fall to save their empire. They think I will fold. They are wrong. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The smell of a police station at 2 in the morning is distinct. It's a suffocating mix of floor wax, stale chemical coffee, and the damp metallic scent of snow melting off dirty boots. I sat in an interrogation room in downtown Cleveland, shivering despite the heavy wool coat I still hadn't taken off. Outside, a lake-effect blizzard was hammering the city, burying the streets in white, but inside the fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing brightness that made everything feel jagged and hyper-real. My hands were shaking against the cold metal table, not just from the temperature, but from a growing, gnawing dread that I couldn't quite name yet. I was Palmer Flynn, the responsible one. The structural engineer with the spotless record. The fixer. I wasn't supposed to be here. The door clicked open and Detective Harris walked in. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot and hard, holding a plastic evidence bag like it was something contaminated. He didn't sit down. He just tossed the bag onto the table between us. It landed with a dull slap. Inside was a piece of notebook paper wrinkled and damp with handwriting I would recognize anywhere. It was my sister Laurel's scrawl, frantic and loopy. It read, "Palmer lives at 1810 Riverfront." Harris leaned over the table, his voice dangerously low. "Ms. Flynn, can you explain to me why a successful structural engineer from a good family would have 2 children dropped off at a derelict industrial park in the middle of a blizzard?" My stomach dropped through the floor. "What? No. That's not my address. I live at 1810 North Riverfront Avenue. It's the condos near the flats. It's safe. It's residential." Harris tapped the table near the bag. "The driver dropped them at 1810 South Riverfront Drive. That's 5 miles away. It's a wasteland of abandoned warehouses and stray dogs. It's 10 degrees below zero out there, Ms. Flynn. If the night security guard hadn't heard them screaming, we'd be finding bodies when the snow melted." I felt the blood drain from my face. South Riverfront. 1 word difference. 2 different worlds. "I didn't agree to this," I stammered, my voice sounding thin and pathetic in the small room. "I told her no. I told Laurel I couldn't watch them." Harris crossed his arms, unimpressed. "That's not what the note says, and that's not what the driver was told." I closed my eyes, the memory of the afternoon flashing back with sickening clarity. I was on a brutal deadline for a city bridge safety proposal, a project that could make or break my career at the firm. I had been staring at blueprints for 10 hours straight when Laurel called. She was slurring slightly, that specific heavy cadence that meant she'd started on the Chardonnay before lunch. She gave me the usual guilt trip, the one my parents had programmed into us since birth. "Family sacrifices for each other, Palmer. You're always the responsible one. I just need a night." My stomach had nodded the familiar reflex to just say yes and fix her mess rising in my throat. But this time the deadline was too important. I had said a firm no. I repeated it. "I will not be home. Do not bring them." I even sent an email immediately after we hung up to have it in writing, explicitly stating I wasn't available. "I have an email," I said to Harris, snapping back to the present. "I sent it at 3:17 p.m. checking out. I told her explicitly not to come." Harris shrugged, his expression cold. "Emails can be written after the fact to cover your tracks once you realized you messed up. Right now I have 2 half-frozen kids who say they were told their aunt was waiting for them." "Let me see them," I begged, standing up. "Please, I need to see Noah and Junie." Harris hesitated, then motioned for me to follow him. We walked down a hallway to a viewing room with a one-way mirror. He flicked a switch and the glass cleared. My knees almost buckled. Noah. My 8-year-old nephew was wrapped in a foil emergency blanket, his jaw clenched so hard the muscles popped, his teeth chattering in a rhythm that looked painful. Junie, only 5, was staring blankly at the wall, clutching a stuffed rabbit that was wet and matted with ice. They looked small. They looked discarded. Seeing them like that triggered a lifetime of conditioning, the urge to take the bullet, to smooth it over, to say it was my fault. I messed up the address just so everyone else could stay clean. That was my role. The scapegoat. The fixer. Harris spoke from behind me, his voice stripping away my defenses. The Uber driver was told their father would be waiting outside. He drove off because the instructions said, drop and go. Those kids banged on a security guard's booth for 20 minutes before he woke up. They almost died, Palmer. The realization hit me harder than the cold. This wasn't a mistake. Laurel didn't just get the address wrong. She knew I said no. She knew I wouldn't be there. She sent them anyway to a place that sounded like mine, but wasn't knowing that when things went wrong, her handwritten note would point the police right at me. She had gambled with their lives to force my hand, assuming I'd simply clean up the mess like I always did. I stared at Junie's frozen rabbit and felt something inside me fracture. It wasn't fear anymore, it was clarity. My own family ambushed me. I whispered, my breath fogging the glass. And they're saying, I sacrificed them. The silence in the interrogation room stretched thin, vibrating with the tension of everything I was holding back. To understand why I didn't just scream the truth immediately, you have to understand the Flynn family architecture. In Cleveland, my father, Dennis Flynn, was a self-made deity, a contractor who had poured the concrete foundations for half the suburbs in the county. My mother, Valerie, was his PR firm, a woman who treated reputation like oxygen. If the image cut off, we died. Then there was Laurel, the golden child, the chaotic, beautiful hurricane who broke things just to see if they would shatter. And finally, there was me. Palmer, the steady one, the structural engineer, the one who spent her life following behind the parade with a broom, sweeping up the confetti and the broken glass. I had spent decades canceling my own plans to cover for Laurel's flu, which was always a hangover. I had written her college essays. I had driven her home from bars at 3 a.m. on work nights so Mom wouldn't find out. Sacrifice wasn't just something I did. It was the price of admission for being a Flynn. Ms. Flynn, Detective Harris said, breaking my trance, you said you have proof. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers stiff. I pulled up the sent folder. Here, look at the timestamp. I shoved the screen toward him. Sent at 3:17 p.m. Subject line. Tonight, I am not home. Read receipt confirmed at 3:24 p.m. She opened it. Detective, she saw it. Harris looked at the screen, his expression unreadable. It's something, he admitted, but it's just text on a screen. People claim technical glitches all the time. We need to verify the intent. We need to call the father. Ethan, I said. He's in Chicago for a conference. We FaceTimed him. When Ethan's face appeared on the screen, he looked disheveled, sitting on the edge of a hotel bed in a polo shirt. He looked from Harris to me, confusion warring with panic. Did your wife tell you Palmer agreed to babysit tonight? Harris asked, his voice sharp. Ethan's face drained of color. No, she told me Palmer was busy. She was furious about it. She said she'd figure something out. He rubbed his face, a dawning horror in his eyes. Let me check the house. We have a Ring doorbell. Give me 2 minutes. The phone went dark for a moment, and when it lit up again, Ethan wasn't looking at us. He was forwarding a video file. Oh my God, he whispered. Palmer, I'm sending it now. Harris tapped his tablet and the video began to play. The audio was crisp, cutting through the sterile room. It showed my sister's front porch. Laurel was swaying a wine glass, sloshing red liquid onto the welcome mat. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. Noah stepped into the frame, looking small and terrified. Mom, are we wearing coats? Noah asked, his voice trembling. Laurel didn't even look at him. She took a sip of wine and half shoved Junie toward the door. Junie was wearing a thin summer dress and leggings, no hat, no gloves. The snow was already whipping sideways in the frame. Laurel never checked her phone. She never opened the Uber app to verify the address. She just bundled them out like unwanted luggage and slammed the door. Harris watched it twice. When he looked up, the hostility was gone, replaced by a grim professional resolve. "You're not being charged, Miss Flynn. This is child endangerment. Negligence. We're shifting the focus to your sister." I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since childhood. But the relief was short-lived. 2 hours later, the heavy security doors swung open. My parents didn't look like grandparents rushing to comfort traumatized children. They looked like CEOs arriving to manage a hostile takeover. Dennis and Valerie Flynn walked right past the viewing room where Noah and Junie were sleeping under heavy blankets. They didn't even glance at the glass. They beelined straight for me. My father sat down opposite me, his jaw set in a hard line. He didn't ask if I was okay. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook. The sound of his pen scratching against the paper was the loudest thing in the room. He tore it out and slid it across the table. $40,000. "It's a gift," Valerie said, her voice smooth, the same tone she used to chair charity galas. "To help with your student loans, or that new car you wanted." "What is this?" I asked, looking at the check. "Family protects family, Palmer," my father said, capping his pen. "You tell the officers you gave Laurel the wrong address. You tell them it was a typo, a misunderstanding. We keep this out of the news. The company is bidding on the stadium contract next month. We can't have child abandonment attached to the Flynn name." I stared at them. They wanted me to perjure myself. They wanted me to take the legal fall for Laurel again so their reputation would remain spotless. The old reflex kicked in, the urge to just take the check, say the words, and make them happy. It would be so easy to be the good daughter one last time. But then I thought of Junie's frozen rabbit. I thought of Noah asking if they needed coats. My hand drifted to my pocket. I tapped the voice memo app on my phone. "So," I said, my voice trembling but loud enough for the microphone, "you want me to lie to the police for money?" My father's jaw tightened. He sensed the shift. My mother leaned in, her perfume cloying and sweet. "If you do this, if you embarrass us, you'll regret it. We will erase you from this family, Palmer. You will be nothing." I looked at the check. Survival or truth? I realized for the first time in 30 years that I actually had a choice. The sound of the check tearing was louder than a gunshot in the quiet interrogation room. I ripped the paper once, then again, letting the jagged blue pieces flutter down onto the metal table between us. My hands were shaking, not from cold this time, but from the adrenaline of finally crossing a line I had been terrified of my entire life. "I'm not lying for you," I said, my voice steadying with every word. "I'm not lying for Laurel. Not ever again." My mother gasped, pressing a hand to her chest as if I'd physically struck her. But it was my father Dennis who terrified me. He didn't yell, he didn't stand up. He just leaned in, invading my personal space with the suffocating weight of his authority. His eyes were flat, devoid of any warmth. "You have no idea who you're going up against, Palmer," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I built this town. I know the judges, the councilmen, the editors. If you cross us on this, I won't just cut you off. I will erase you from every room in this city." They left without another word, sweeping out to manage their PR crisis, leaving me alone with the shreds of their bribe. I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. The next morning I woke up to a phone that was vibrating so hard it was dancing across my nightstand. I had 47 missed calls and over 100 notifications. I opened Instagram and felt the blood drain from my head. Laurel had posted a selfie. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. Her mascara was artfully smudged, her eyes wide and watery, looking fragile and broken. The caption read, "The darkest night of my life. Betrayed by my own sister when I needed her most. A mother should never have to fear for her children because of family jealousy. Please pray for us." It was a lie so bold it was breathtaking. And it was working. The comments section was a firing squad. Cousins I hadn't seen in years were posting, "How could you do this?" Palmer. Old ladies from our church were commenting, "Family doesn't abandon family. Shameful." Even my high school friends were liking it. Laurel had beaten me to the narrative, painting herself as the victim of a jealous, childless spinster sister who had recklessly endangered her niece and nephew. My phone rang again, an aunt screaming into my voicemail that I needed to fix this and apologize before I killed my mother from stress. I didn't have time to process the betrayal because an hour later, I was called into the corner office at work. My boss, Dana Cho, was a legend in structural engineering. She was a Korean-American senior partner known for being ruthless with deadlines and terrifyingly sharp. I walked into her office expecting a severance package. I knew how my father operated. He would have called ahead. Dana was sitting behind her glass desk reading a printout. She didn't look up when I entered. "Sit down, Palmer." I sat, bracing myself. "Dana, I can explain." "I received an email this morning from Dennis Flynn," she interrupted, sliding the paper across the desk. I looked down. The language was professional, but the threat was nuclear. It implied that I was under active police investigation for recklessly endangering minors, and suggested that the firm should distance itself from me immediately if they wanted to maintain their eligibility for the upcoming municipal stadium contract, a contract Flynn Construction was managing. "He's trying to strong-arm you," I said, my throat tight. "He's using the contract to get me fired." Dana took off her glasses and looked at me. For a long moment she was silent. Then she leaned back. "I already called Detective Harris." My heart stopped. "You did?" "I wanted to know if my lead engineer was actually a criminal," she said calmly. "Harris told me you're a witness, not a suspect. He also told me about the video and the check." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray Cleveland skyline. "Palmer, this firm relies on integrity. If a bridge fails, people die. We don't deal in lies, and we certainly don't reward bullies." She turned back to me, her expression fierce. "You are not getting erased because your parents are loud and rich. That's not how we do things here." She offered me paid administrative leave to handle the legal storm, not as a punishment, but as a shield. "I'm putting you in touch with Aisha Romero. She's the best family law attorney in the state. Go get your life back." An hour later, I was sitting in Aisha Romero's office. She was sharp, empathetic, and terrifyingly focused. She listened to the timeline, reviewed the email timestamps, and listened to the audio recording I had made of my parents trying to bribe me. "This is gold," Aisha said, her eyes gleaming. "But here's the hard part, Palmer. We can't use it yet." "Why not?" I asked. "It proves everything." "Because if we show our hand now, Laurel will change her story," Aisha explained, leaning forward. "She'll claim she was confused or she was grieving. We need her to commit to the lie. We need her to say it under oath to a judge on the record." She laid out a strategy that made my stomach turn. We were going to let Laurel lie. We were going to let her paint me as the villain in the preliminary hearings. We were going to let her think she was winning. "Laurel is going to double down," Aisha said. "And when she does, we don't just defend you. We expose all of them. But until then, it's going to feel like you're losing." "What if she wins?" I asked, the fear creeping back in. "What if they finally erase me for good?" Aisha looked at me, dead serious. "Then we appeal. Then we go public. But you're not the one who should be afraid of the truth anymore." My phone buzzed on the desk. A text from my mother popped up. "Last chance. Drop this, apologize to your sister, or the police report disappears and you take the fall alone. Choose us or the cops." I showed the screen to Aisha. She nodded. "Good. Let them think you're scared. Next hearing, we stop playing nice." The Cuyahoga County Domestic Relations Court didn't look like the majestic halls of justice you see on television. It smelled of wet wool anxiety and industrial carpet cleaner that couldn't quite mask decades of misery. The benches were hardwood, the lighting was sallow, and the clerks looked like they hadn't slept since the 90s. I sat next to Aisha, my hands folded tightly in my lap, wearing a gray sweater and slacks she had approved the day before. "Don't look defensive," Aisha had told me in the elevator, adjusting my collar. "Look exhausted. Look honest. Do not perform. Laurel is going to suck all the air out of the room with her performance. We need to be the ground she crashes into." She was right. When the doors opened, Laurel floated in. She was wearing a cream-colored wool suit that made her look soft, angelic, and impossibly fragile. Her hair was pulled back in a loose, modest bun. She didn't look like a woman who had shoved her children out into a blizzard. She looked like a grieving Madonna. My parents walked behind her, flanking her like royal guards. Dennis and Valerie Flynn sat in the front row, chins high, radiating a silent demand for respect. They didn't even look at me. To them, I was already a ghost in the room. The hearing began, and it was a masterclass in fiction. Laurel's lawyer, a slick man from a downtown firm whose suit cost more than my car, stood up and painted a picture that made my stomach turn. He described a loving, overwhelmed mother who had reached out to her sister for help only to be betrayed by a miscommunication. He used words like jealousy and career-obsessed, subtly implying that I was a bitter, childless woman who had simply forgotten my duties because I was too busy climbing the corporate ladder. Then they called Laurel to the stand. Watching my sister lie to a judge was a surreal, out-of-body experience. She dabbed at dry eyes with a tissue, her voice trembling just enough to sound heartbroken. "Palmer told me she would be there," Laurel said, looking directly at the judge. "She sounded excited to see the kids. I trusted her completely. If I had known she wasn't home, I would never have let them go." I dug my fingernails into my palms so hard I felt the skin break. Every instinct in my body screamed to stand up, to shout about the email, to play the recording. But Aisha's hand rested heavily on my forearm, anchoring me. "Wait," her grip said. "Let her dig." Aisha stood up for cross-examination. She didn't attack. She didn't yell. She walked to the podium with a calm, almost bored demeanor. "Mrs. Hayes," Aisha said, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet room, "you are absolutely certain that my client Palmer Flynn verbally agreed to babysit that night?" "Yes," Laurel said, sniffing. "She promised." "And you were sober and clear-headed when you made the decision to send the children to her house?" Laurel straightened her spine, looking insulted. "Of course. I'm a mother. I would never endanger my children." "So there is no doubt in your mind about the timeline of events?" "None," Laurel said firmly. "No further questions, Your Honor." Aisha sat down. I looked at her, panicked. That was it. We were just going to let that stand. Judge Regina Cole adjusted her glasses and looked over the bench at me. Her expression was stern. "This appears to be a tragic miscommunication," she ruled. "While the court is granting temporary sole custody to Mr. Hayes, the mother, Laurel Hayes, will be granted supervised visitation twice a week." Then Judge Cole fixed her eyes on me. "Ms. Flynn, while you are not on trial here, I am troubled by your failure to communicate clearly with your family when children's safety was at stake. In the future, I expect more diligence." It felt like a physical slap. I had been the only responsible person in the equation, and I was being reprimanded while the liar walked away with visitation rights. The gavel banged. We were dismissed. I walked out into the hallway feeling hollowed out. I had done what Aisha asked, and it felt like losing. I was heading toward the elevators when a shadow blocked my path. My parents had cornered me near the water fountains. Valerie stepped close, her face contorted in a sneer I had never seen in public. "You embarrassed us," she hissed, her voice shaking with rage. "Dragging this into a courtroom, making your sister cry in front of strangers." Dennis leaned in, his voice a low rumble. "You're done, Palmer. This little stunt is over. Drop the recordings you think you have. Drop the cops, or forget you ever had parents. We will erase you so thoroughly you won't be able to get a job sweeping floors in this city." They turned and walked away, their heels clicking in unison on the marble floor. I stood there trembling. The old terror, the fear of being cast out, of being unloved, washed over me. But as I watched them retreat, I realized something. They weren't acting like family. They were acting like a syndicate protecting an asset. They only loved me when I was silent. I pulled out my phone. My hands were steady now. I opened my text thread with Aisha. "I'm in," I typed. "Whatever it takes." Aisha's reply came through 3 seconds later. "Good. Next hearing, we stop playing nice." The final custody hearing felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a public execution waiting for a volunteer. The courtroom was packed. The local press had sniffed out the scent of blood in the water. The headline, "Prominent Contractor Dynasty in Custody Dispute," was apparently too good to ignore. The air was thick with the heat of bodies and the murmur of speculation. I sat at the plaintiff's table feeling the weight of 100 eyes on the back of my neck. But for the first time, I didn't feel entirely alone. In the back row, silent and stoic, sat Dana Cho and 3 of my colleagues from the engineering firm. They hadn't waved or made a scene. They just sat there, a quiet wall of support that told me I had a world outside this toxic family. Laurel was recalled to the stand. She looked even more polished than before, if that was possible. She wore a soft blue blouse the color of innocence, and she repeated her story with the confidence of someone who had never faced a consequence she couldn't charm her way out of. She testified that I had said yes, that she had responsibly arranged the Uber, and that she truly believed I was waiting at the door. She dabbed at dry eyes again, turning to the judge with a trembling chin. "A mother is willing to be sacrificed in the press to get her children back," Laurel said, her voice catching theatrically. "I've been painted as a villain, but I did everything out of love." My stomach churned, but I looked at Aisha. She was perfectly still, like a predator waiting for the wind to shift. When Laurel finished, Aisha stood up. She didn't bring a notepad to the podium. She just brought a remote control. "Mrs. Hayes," Aisha said, her voice terrifyingly pleasant. "You testified that you were sure my client agreed to babysit. You testified that this was a tragic miscommunication." "Yes," Laurel said, lifting her chin. "And you testified that you are a responsible mother." "I am." "Let's look at Exhibit A." Aisha pointed to the large monitor mounted on the wall. The screen flickered to life, displaying a blown-up image of an email. The courtroom went silent. The text was impossible to miss. "I will not be home. Do not bring the kids. I will not open the door." Below it, highlighted in neon yellow, was the red receipt, timestamp 3:24 p.m. "Mrs. Hayes," Aisha asked quietly, "did you read this email?" Laurel's face drained of color. She stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. I must have missed it. I get so many emails. I forgot." "You forgot," Aisha repeated. "You forgot that the person watching your children explicitly told you she wasn't there." Judge Cole's expression hardened, her brow furrowing, but Aisha wasn't done. "Let's move to Exhibit B." The screen changed. This time it was a video. The timestamp read 6:42 p.m. The audio crackled through the courtroom speakers, the sound of wind and sleet. On screen, Laurel stumbled into the frame. She was clutching a wine glass, swaying dangerously. Noah appeared, looking terrified. "Mom, where are our coats?" The video. Laurel ignored him. She took a sip of wine, sloshing it onto her hand, and shoved the children toward the darkness of the storm. Junie was in a summer dress. The wind whipped her hair across her face. Laurel didn't check her phone. She didn't check the app. She just pushed them out and slammed the door. A collective gasp ripped through the gallery. Someone in the back row whispered loud enough to be heard, "Oh my God." Laurel was frozen on the stand, staring at her own image. Aisha turned to her, her voice dropping to a chill. "How many drinks did you have before you sent your children into a blizzard in summer clothes, Mrs. Hayes?" Laurel didn't answer. She looked at her lawyer, panic finally shattering her mask. "And finally," Aisha said, relentless, Exhibit C. This time there was no image, just sound. It was the recording from the police station. The acoustics were tinny, but the voices were unmistakable. Consider it a gift, my father's voice boomed. You just tell them you typed the address wrong. Then my mother's voice sharp and hissing. Think of the family. Don't erase everything we've sacrificed for you over some silly police report. Dennis and Valerie Flynn went rigid in the front row. My father looked as if he had been struck in the chest with a sledgehammer. The judge slammed her hand down on the bench, cutting the audio off her face, flushed with fury. That recording, Judge Cole demanded, pointing at Aisha. Where was that taken? Inside the second precinct interrogation room, Your Honor, Aisha replied, while my client was being pressured to falsify a police report. Judge Cole turned her gaze on Laurel and then to my parents. The look she gave them could have stripped paint from the walls. I have heard enough. This is not a custody dispute. This is a criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice and endanger minors. Bailiffs moved forward before the judge even finished speaking. Laurel stood up, screaming, "No, you can't! Daddy, do something!" Sit down, Mr. Flynn, the bailiff barked as my father half rose from his seat. Judge Cole's voice rang out like a bell. I am finding that Laurel Hayes has committed perjury in my courtroom. I am referring this matter immediately to the district attorney for charges of child endangerment and obstruction. Bail is revoked. She turned to the clerk. Sole legal and physical custody is granted to the father, Ethan Hayes. Palmer Flynn is hereby appointed permanent emergency guardian to assist the father. As the bailiffs clicked the handcuffs onto Laurel's wrists, she began to sob ugly, terrified sounds that echoed off the high ceiling. My parents sat paralyzed, watching their golden child being led away. As the courtroom erupted into chaos, Dennis Flynn turned his head slowly to look at me. His face was a mask of pure, distilled hatred. He mouthed 3 words clear as day: I will ruin you. I looked back at him, at the man who had controlled my life for 3 decades, the man who thought his money could rewrite reality. I looked at his empire crumbling in real time. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They threatened to erase me, I thought, watching the bailiffs guide my sister through the side door. But they're the ones disappearing. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind me, sealing away the chaos of my sister's screaming and my father's silent, venomous rage. The hallway was quiet, the air cool and still. Leaning against the wall near the window was the guardian ad litem, a kind woman named Sarah, and sitting on a bench were Noah and Junie. When Junie saw me, she didn't hesitate. She slid off the bench and ran her small sneakers squeaking on the tile, colliding with my legs, in a tackle hug that nearly knocked the wind out of me. Noah followed slower, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking at me with eyes that were too old for an 8-year-old. Are we safe now? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I knelt down, wrapping my arms around both of them, smelling the strawberry shampoo in Junie's hair and the faint, dusty scent of the courtroom on Noah's jacket. I looked him dead in the eye. Yes, nobody is ever going to use you as a pawn again. Not ever. For the first time in my life, I made a promise to a family member that I knew I didn't have to lie to keep. The world outside the courthouse, however, was less quiet. The local news didn't just run the story, they devoured it. The headline, "Prominent Contractor and Wife Caught in Custody Bribe Scheme," dominated the evening news for a week. The video of the bribe, my father's arrogance, my mother's hiss about erasing me played on loop. The fallout was swift and brutal. Dennis Flynn lost the bid for the municipal stadium contract within 48 hours. The city council couldn't afford the optics of doing business with a man under investigation for obstructing justice in a child endangerment case. Valerie was quietly asked to step down from the 3 charity boards she had ruled with an iron fist for a decade. Their social currency, the only thing they truly valued, evaporated. My phone still rang, but the tone had shifted. I got voicemail after voicemail from extended relatives, cousins, aunts, people who had been silent for years, calling me dramatic or vindictive. They begged me to fix the family, to recant, to stop the bleeding. But for every angry message from a relative, I got 2 from neighbors, coworkers, and even strangers. People stopped me in the grocery store to say they were proud I stood up for the kids. My team at the engineering firm treated me with a quiet, sturdy respect. I realized then that I had spent my whole life confusing blood with community. Community wasn't the people who demanded you bleed for them, it was the people who handed you a bandage. When I returned to the office, Dana Cho didn't treat me like damaged goods. She called me into her office and handed me a file. "The city fast-tracked your bridge safety proposal," she said. "They want the Flynn name off everything, but they want you. They know you're the one who refused to lie." She paused, then slid a second folder across the desk. "And there's this. The city is reclaiming that industrial zone on South Riverfront, the place where the kids were dropped off. They want to turn it into a green space. They asked specifically for you to design the community playground." I stared at the map of the derelict wasteland that had almost killed my niece and nephew. The irony wasn't lost on me. The place where my family had tried to dispose of us would become the place where I built something permanent and safe. I took the file. "I'll do it." My parents didn't give up easily. The letters started arriving a month later. Some were threatening, written in my father's jagged scrawl, reminding me of the investment they had made in my life. Others were manipulative masterpieces from my mother weeping on paper about how I had broken her heart and how they were willing to forgive me if I just dropped the restraining order. They never acknowledged the bribe. They never asked about the kids. They only mourned their own reputation. I sat with Aisha in her office, a stack of unopened letters on the desk between us. "You don't have to read them," she said gently. "You can choose silence." And I did. I realized that love without respect and safety isn't love, it's just control. I blocked their numbers. I marked the letters, "Return to sender." I chose no contact. Late one night, 6 months after the trial, I was sitting in my living room. Noah and Junie were asleep in the guest room. Ethan had custody, but they stayed with me on weekends, and tonight was a movie night. The apartment was quiet, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic of the city I was helping to rebuild. My phone buzzed. It was Aisha. "Palmer," she said, her voice professional but soft. "Laurel's criminal case is moving forward. The DA is offering a plea deal, rehab, probation, and a very long period without unsupervised contact. But before they finalize it, the judge wants to know if you want to submit a victim impact statement." I looked toward the hallway where the kids were sleeping safe and warm. I thought about the cold wind that night. I thought about the check on the table. "Do I have to?" I asked. "No," Aisha said. "But it's the final record. It's the truth that stays in the file forever." I hung up and opened my laptop. The screen glowed white in the dark room. I thought about revenge. I thought about how easy it would be to write something hateful, something that would burn Laurel to the ground. But I realized I didn't want revenge. I just wanted safety. I wanted the truth to stand like a retaining wall holding back the flood so it could never touch us again. I typed the title at the top of the blank page, "Statement of What My Family Did to Me." Then for the first time I started to write the whole story, not as a victim, but as a witness. 3 years later, the wind off the Cuyahoga River felt different. It wasn't the biting razor-wire cold of that February night. It was a warm, late summer breeze, carrying the scent of fresh water and blooming wildflowers. I stood on a podium at the edge of the newly christened Safe Harbor Commons, listening to the mayor speak about resilience and urban renewal. Behind him, where the derelict, hollowed-out warehouses used to loom like skeletons, there was now a sprawling green space. There were walking paths, picnic tables, and a massive modern playground structure that looked like a series of interlocking bridges. "Communities are defined by how they protect their most vulnerable," the mayor said, his voice amplified over the crowd. "And this park is a testament to turning our darkest corners into our brightest lights." He gestured to me. I stepped forward, smoothing the skirt of my dress, a dress I bought without asking anyone's opinion. I wasn't just the woman who testified against her family anymore. I was the lead engineer. I placed my hand on the bronze plaque bolted to the entrance stone. It read, "Designed by Palmer Flynn, dedicated to all children who deserve to feel safe." The applause was polite, but I wasn't listening to the crowd. I was watching the monkey bars. Junie, now 8 years old and absolutely fearless, was hanging upside down, her laughter ringing out clear and bright, cutting through the heavy, humid air. Noah was sitting on a stone wall nearby. At 11, he had stretched out, losing the softness of childhood. He had a sketchbook open on his knees, drawing the suspension cables of the nearby bridge with an intensity that mirrored my own. Ethan stood near the swings talking to a few other parents. He looked 10 years younger than the terrified man in the hotel room FaceTime call. He waved at me, a genuine, easy smile on his face. Standing next to me, holding my hand, was Mark, a quiet, kind man from my neighborhood who knew the whole story and never asked me to be smaller than I was. But as I squeezed his hand, I knew that the real love story here wasn't romantic. It was the family I had built out of the wreckage. Later, as the crowd thinned and the sun began to dip low over the water, I sat on a bench watching the river churn. My mind drifted back to the victim impact statement I had submitted all those years ago. It had been the hardest thing I ever wrote. I hadn't used it to demand maximum punishment or to twist the knife. I had used it to draw a line. I had told the court that access to children is a privilege, not a right, and that biology is not a hall pass for abuse. Laurel had taken the plea. It was the only rational move left. She did 6 months in a state-mandated rehab facility and was currently living in Wisconsin working a retail job. She had limited supervised video calls with the kids twice a week. I didn't hate her. Hate takes too much energy. I just didn't know her anymore, and I was okay with that. I no longer confused forgiveness with access. She was safe, and we were safe, and the distance between us was the wall that kept it that way. The shadow of my parents was longer but fainter. They still lived in their big house in the Heights, but the parties had stopped. Dennis had lost his empire piece by piece, not because of a lawsuit, but because the community simply turned its back on him. Reputation is fragile. Once people saw who they really were, people who would sacrifice their own grandchildren for a contract, the invitations stopped coming. They sent me letters occasionally. The handwriting was stiff, the sentiments bitter. They lamented that I had turned the whole community against them. They still didn't get it. I hadn't turned anyone. I had just turned on the lights. Aunt Palmer. I looked up. Noah was standing there clutching his sketchbook. He looked at the river, then back at the playground where Junie was still spinning in circles. "This used to be the bad place, right?" he asked quietly. "The place where the Uber left us." I nodded. I didn't lie to him anymore. "Yeah, it was." He kicked at the dirt with his sneaker. "It's cool now. The bridge you built is cool." He paused, then looked me dead in the eye, possessing a gravity that broke my heart and healed it all at once. "Thanks for not taking the money. Thanks for not letting them erase us." I felt tears prick my eyes, hot and sudden. "I would never let them erase you, Noah. You're the most real thing I know." That was the moment the last of the anger evaporated. I realized my revenge hadn't been about destroying my parents or humiliating Laurel. It was this. It was Noah sketching bridges. It was Junie laughing. It was the fact that we were standing on the very ground they tried to use to dispose of us, and we had turned it into a foundation. I had refused to be the sacrifice. I had refused to live in the story they wrote for me. That evening back at my apartment, the mood was light. The balcony door was open, letting in the sounds of the city. Junie was in the kitchen making hot chocolate, arguing with Ethan about how many marshmallows were legally allowed in one mug. Noah was showing Mark his drawings. The space was small, warm, and noisy. It was imperfect. It was messy. It was mine. I stepped out onto the balcony and opened my journal. I uncapped my pen and looked out at the lights of the bridges spanning the river, structures built to carry weight, built to endure storms. I wrote, "They ambushed me with lies. They sacrificed me to protect their reputation, and they threatened to erase me from the only family I thought I had. They thought that if they took away their approval, I would disappear. But I walked through the storm and I'm still here. They lost their control. They lost their audience. They lost the war they started. I found my voice. I found my spine. And most importantly, I found my home." I closed the journal, capped the pen, and listened to the laughter spilling out from the kitchen. I didn't need to look back anymore. The future was waiting, and for the first time in my life, I was the one designing it. Palmer finally built a life that was truly hers, proving that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into. If you enjoyed this journey from betrayal to vindication, please consider subscribing. What would you have done in her position? Let us know below, because we read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.